I woke up to the rhythmic sound of a heavy mallet striking wood, a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my sleeping bag. It was 3 in the morning, and the forest should have been silent, save for the wind in the pines and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I laid there for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming or that a branch was simply knocking against a trunk. But then came the unmistakable metallic jingle of a zipper, followed by the soft rustle of heavy nylon fabric being pulled tight. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized the sound was coming from directly outside my tent, not more than 3 feet away from where my head rested. I was camping at a secluded spot 5 miles from the nearest trailhead, a place I had chosen specifically because no one else was supposed to be there. Who could possibly be pitching a tent in total darkness, so close to me that I could hear them breathing? I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of my tactical flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. The silence that followed the last thud was even more terrifying than the noise itself, because it meant whoever was out there was now standing still. I wondered if they knew I was awake, or if they were waiting for me to make the first move. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, each one more frantic than the last, as I tried to understand the logic of a stranger encroaching on my space in such a deliberate way. Why didn't they call out a greeting or ask if the spot was taken? Why would someone trek through the dense, midnight woods just to set up camp right on top of a lone hiker? Slowly, I sat up, the fabric of my sleeping bag letting out a faint hiss that sounded like a scream in the oppressive quiet. I gripped the flashlight tight, my knuckles turning white, as I prepared myself for what I might see when I opened that door. I counted to 3, my pulse thundering in my ears, and then I grabbed the zipper of my tent and pulled it down in one jagged, violent motion. I swung the beam of my light outward, expecting to see a confused hiker or perhaps a forest ranger, but the sight that met my eyes made the blood freeze in my veins. There, standing exactly 3 feet from my entrance, was another tent. It was not just any tent. It was an identical model to mine, the same forest green color, the same orange rainfly, and the same specific brand logo catching the glare of my LED beam. It looked like a mirror image of my own campsite, placed with such precision that it felt like a glitch in reality. The stakes were driven into the dirt at the exact same angles, and even the pair of muddy boots sitting outside the flap looked exactly like the ones I had left by my own door. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip as I panned the light upward, searching for the person who had built this replica in the dead of night. The forest around me was a wall of blackness, the trees standing like ancient sentinels watching the scene unfold. I called out, my voice cracking and sounding small against the vastness of the wilderness, asking who was there and what they wanted. There was no reply, only the sound of the wind whistling through the needles above. I stepped out of my tent, my bare feet hitting the cold, damp earth, and I felt a wave of pure vulnerability wash over me. I was alone in the woods with a silent shadow who was playing a twisted game of imitation. I walked a slow circle around the second tent, my light flickering over its smooth surfaces, looking for any sign of life inside. The shadow of a person was visible through the thin fabric, a dark, slumped shape sitting perfectly still in the center of the floor. They weren't lying down. They were sitting upright, facing the wall of the tent that looked directly into mine. I realized then with a jolt of horror that they had been watching my silhouette from just inches away while I slept. "Hey, I see you in there," I yelled. My voice gained a sharp edge of desperation as the adrenaline began to flood my system. I waited for the person to move, to speak, or to explain this bizarre behavior, but the shape remained motionless, like a statue carved from shadow. I began to wonder if this was some kind of elaborate trap, a way to lure me into a confrontation while someone else moved in from the trees. I spun around, sweeping my light in a wide arc, checking the perimeter for a second intruder, but there was nothing but the shifting shadows of the undergrowth. I looked back at the second tent, and my heart nearly stopped when I noticed a small detail I had missed before. Hanging from the top of their tent pole was a small silver carabiner with a frayed blue paracord attached to it. I reached up and felt the top of my own tent, my fingers finding the exact same carabiner and the exact same frayed cord that I had used to repair my gear 3 months ago. This wasn't just a similar tent. This person was using my gear, or at least things that were identical down to the smallest damage. A wave of cold sweat broke out across my forehead as the realization hit me that I was being hunted by someone who had been studying me for a long time. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a performance. I retreated toward my tent, my mind racing through my options for escape. My car was miles away, and the trail was treacherous in the dark, filled with loose rock and steep drop-offs. If I ran, I would be at a disadvantage, but if I stayed, I was sitting in a cage waiting for the predator to strike. I ducked back inside my tent and frantically began to shove my essentials into my pack, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip my water bottle. Every time I heard a twig snap outside, I jumped, convinced that the occupant of the second tent was finally stepping out to finish the game. I kept my flashlight off now, hoping to use the darkness to my advantage, but the moon was bright enough that I could still see the silhouette of the other tent through my mesh window. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a zipper again. It was slow and deliberate, the teeth of the track clicking one by one in a steady, agonizing rhythm. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest, as I watched the flap of the second tent begin to open. A hand reached out, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the fabric. It didn't look like the hand of a monster. It looked human, which somehow made it 1,000 times worse. I didn't wait to see the face of the person attached to that hand. I grabbed my pack, lunged out the back exit of my tent, and sprinted into the tree lean without looking back. I ran blindly, the branches tearing at my skin and the rocks bruising my feet, but I didn't care about the pain. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, a heavy, crashing pace that matched my own, as if the person was still mirroring my every move even in the chase. I scrambled up a steep embankment, my lungs burning and my throat raw from the cold air, and I looked down toward my campsite. From this vantage point, I could see 2 small patches of green in the clearing, lit by the pale moonlight. I saw a figure emerge from the second tent and walk over to mine. They didn't chase me further. Instead, they sat down exactly where I had been sitting just moments before, mimicking my posture perfectly. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I hiked through the night, guided by instinct and the sheer terror of being followed, until the first rays of dawn began to bleed through the canopy. I reached the trailhead just as the sun was rising, my body trembling with exhaustion and shock. I sat in my car with the doors locked, watching the woods for any sign of a forest green tent or a pale, thin hand. I never went back for my gear, and I never went camping alone again because I knew that somewhere out there was a version of me still sitting in the dark, waiting for the mirror to be completed. I called the local authorities from the safety of a diner 10 miles away, and they sent a deputy up to the coordinates I provided. When he returned a few hours later, he told me the clearing was completely empty. There were no tents, no boots, and no signs of a struggle. The only thing they found were 2 sets of tent stakes driven into the dirt, spaced exactly 3 feet apart, forming 2 perfect rectangles where someone had been waiting in the silence. I was sitting by my small campfire, watching the orange embers dance against the gathering gloom, when a man stepped out of the tree lean with such suddenness that I nearly dropped my metal mug of coffee. He was dressed in the standard olive drab trousers and a tan button-up shirt that you would expect a park ranger to wear, but something about the way the fabric hung off his frame felt immediately wrong. It was too large, the sleeves frayed at the edges, and the brass badge pinned to his chest didn't catch the light like polished metal should. Instead, it had the dull, flat look of painted cardboard. He didn't have a radio on his shoulder or a utility belt, just a heavy flashlight gripped in one hand and a long, wooden walking stick in the other. He stood just at the edge of the firelight, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and he didn't say a word for several seconds as he scanned my entire campsite with a slow, predatory intensity. "Evening, traveler," he finally said, his voice raspy and thin, like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together in the dark. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have had a sighting of a problem bear just a half-mile up the ridge, and I am under orders to evacuate this entire sector of the woods immediately. I felt a cold prickle of sweat break out along my hairline, not because of the mention of a bear, but because of the way he was staring at my car keys sitting on the small folding table next to my tent. I had been checking the ranger station's digital board before I hiked in, and there had been absolutely no mention of predatory activity or trail closures in this specific valley. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady as I stood up, making sure to keep the fire between us as a meager barrier. That is strange, because I spoke to the head office this morning, and they said the area was completely clear for the weekend. I watched his posture shift instantly. His shoulders went rigid, and his grip on the walking stick tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He didn't offer a name or a badge number, and he didn't reach for a map to show me the restricted zone. Instead, he took a heavy step forward into the light, revealing a face that was deeply lined and eyes that were far too wide and alert. The situation changed an hour ago, and the main office is currently overwhelmed with the coordination of the search teams, he replied, his tone becoming sharper and more demanding as he gestured toward the dark woods behind him. You need to leave your gear here and follow me down the service trail to the secondary access road where the transport vehicles are waiting. My heart began to race with a frantic rhythm because the service trail he was pointing to didn't lead toward the road at all. It led deeper into the dense, overgrown ravine where the terrain became nearly impassable. I realized in that moment that this man was not trying to save me from a bear. He was trying to lead me away from my only means of escape and into a place where no one would ever hear me scream. I looked at his badge again, and my suspicion was confirmed when I saw a small piece of the cardboard backing peeling away at the corner, revealing the gray underside of a cereal box. I felt a wave of pure, icy terror wash over me as I realized I was standing 5 miles from civilization with a man who was impersonating an officer to lure me into the shadows. I think I will just pack up my car and drive out the way I came, I said, reaching slowly for my keys while keeping my eyes locked on his. The man's demeanor changed instantly from a fake professional to something much more sinister and aggressive. He didn't move toward the woods anymore. He moved toward me, the heavy wooden stick swinging in a short, practiced arc by his side. I cannot allow you to use the main road, as it is currently blocked by emergency vehicles and heavy equipment, he snapped, his voice rising to a frantic pitch that made my skin crawl. You are interfering with a government operation, and I will have to escort you by force if you do not comply with my instructions right now. I knew then that if I followed him, I was never coming back, but if I tried to run for my car, he was close enough to intercept me before I could even get the door unlocked. I had to create a distraction, something to break his focus for just a few seconds so I could make a break for the driver's seat. I glanced down at my boiling pot of coffee still sitting on the edge of the fire grate, the steam rising in thick, white plumes. I moved with a sudden, desperate burst of energy, grabbing the handle with my insulated glove and swinging the scalding liquid directly toward his face. He let out a guttural howl of rage and pain as he dropped his flashlight and scrambled backward, clawing at his eyes while the dark liquid soaked into his fake uniform. I didn't wait to see if he was badly hurt. I lunged for my keys, ripped the tent flap open to grab my phone, and bolted toward my SUV. I could hear him screaming behind me, a sound that wasn't human anymore, just a raw, vibrating noise of pure malice. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so violently that I dropped the keys onto the floor mats, and for a terrifying second, I couldn't find them in the dark. I heard the heavy thud of his boots hitting the gravel right outside my door, and then the sound of the wooden stick smashing against my side window with a force that made the glass spiderweb into 1,000 shimmering cracks. I screamed, diving for the keys and jamming them into the ignition just as the window shattered inward, showering me in tiny, sharp cubes of safety glass. The engine roared to life and I slammed the car into reverse, not even caring that I was dragging my expensive tent and gear under the wheel wells as I backed out of the sight. I saw him in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road with his face twisted in a mask of fury, his hand reaching out to grab the door handle as I accelerated. I shifted into drive and floored it, the tires spinning on the loose dirt before finally catching traction and propelling me forward into the night. I drove for 20 minutes without looking back, my breath coming in jagged, sobbing gasps as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of the situation set in. I didn't stop until I saw the bright, artificial lights of a 24-hour gas station on the edge of the county line. I pulled into the lot, parked directly under a security camera, and sat there for a long time, just watching the entrance to the highway. When the real police arrived to take my statement, they told me that there had been reports of a man breaking into park storage sheds and stealing old uniforms over the last month. They never found him that night, but they found the cardboard badge lying in the dirt near my abandoned campfire, along with a roll of duct tape and a set of heavy zip ties that he had dropped when I threw the coffee. I realized then that the service trail he wanted me to follow was likely where he had prepared a place for me, and if I had been just a few seconds slower, I would have become another missing person poster on the ranger station's digital board. I still have a small scar on my hand from the shattered glass of my car window, a constant reminder that the most dangerous things in the woods aren't the animals that live there. They are the people who put on a mask and wait for you to trust them. I had always found a strange kind of peace in the absolute darkness of the deep woods, but that peace shattered the moment I realized that something was watching me through a lens I couldn't see. It was my third night camping alone in the high ridges of the backcountry, and the silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight against my eardrums. I was sitting just outside my tent, nursing the last of my tea and preparing to crawl into my sleeping bag, when I noticed a tiny, faint pinprick of blue light hovering near a cluster of old-growth cedar trees about 50 yards away. It didn't flicker like a firefly, and it didn't move with the jagged, swaying motion of a handheld flashlight. Instead, it remained perfectly level, gliding horizontally through the trunk line with a smooth, mechanical precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. I reached for my own heavy-duty lantern, but as soon as my fingers brushed the power button, the blue light vanished instantly, leaving nothing but the oppressive velvet blackness of the forest. I sat frozen for several minutes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I strained to hear the sound of footsteps or the rustle of nylon clothing. There was nothing but the distant, lonely sigh of the wind moving through the upper canopy, yet I could feel a heavy gaze pressing against me from the shadows. I tried to tell myself it was just a reflection of a star or perhaps a strange atmospheric trick, but the logical part of my brain knew that the light had been too artificial, too deliberate. I decided to play a dangerous game of cat and mouse to confirm my fears, so I leaned back and clicked off my headlamp, plunging my entire campsite into total darkness. I waited, counting my breaths in the dark, and then I saw it again. The same cold, electric blue glow, but this time it was 10 yards closer, positioned behind a fallen log that offered a direct line of sight into my tent. A wave of icy dread washed over me as I realized the blue light wasn't a signal. It was a status indicator on a piece of high-end equipment, likely a digital night vision scope or a thermal imaging camera. Someone was out there in the brush, invisible to the naked eye, watching my every move through a screen and waiting for me to become vulnerable. I felt a sickening sense of exposure, as if the darkness I usually used for cover had been stripped away, leaving me standing under a spotlight that only the hunter could see. Why would someone carry thousands of dollars of tactical gear into the middle of a national forest just to stalk a lone camper in the dead of night? I didn't dare turn my light back on, fearing that the sudden glare would give away my exact position and provoke an immediate confrontation. Instead, I began to crawl backward on my hands and knees, feeling for the zipper of my tent with trembling fingers while keeping my eyes locked on that tiny blue dot. Every time I blinked, the light seemed to jump forward a few feet, closing the gap with a terrifying, silent efficiency that suggested the person holding it was a trained tracker. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last, as I wondered if they were armed or if they were simply filming me for some twisted, dark web audience. As I backed into the safety of my tent, I felt my hand brush against the cold metal of my bare spray canister, and I gripped it like a lifeline in the suffocating heat of the nylon enclosure. I lay flat on my stomach, peering through the small mesh window at the bottom of the rainfly, and that was when the blue light stopped moving entirely. It remained fixed on my tent, a steady, unblinking eye that seemed to be burning a hole through the fabric. I realized then that they weren't waiting for me to sleep. They were waiting for me to panic and run into the woods where they could track me with ease across the uneven terrain. Hours passed in a state of agonizing tension, the kind that makes your muscles ache and your eyes burn from the constant strain of watching the void. Around 4 in the morning, the temperature dropped significantly, and a light mist began to roll through the trees, catching the faint blue glow and turning it into a soft, ghostly halo. Through the fog, I saw the silhouette of a figure finally emerge from behind the log, a tall, thin shape covered in dark, tactical clothing that blended perfectly with the bark of the trees. They were holding a device to their face, a set of goggles that emitted that haunting blue light, and they began to walk toward my tent with a slow, deliberate gait that suggested they knew exactly where I was hiding. My breathing became shallow and jagged as I realized they were now less than 20 feet away, and the silence was finally broken by the soft, rhythmic crunch of dead leaves under their heavy boots. I knew I couldn't stay in the tent any longer, as it was nothing more than a thin fabric trap that would easily be cut open from the outside. I reached for my car keys and my bear spray, and in one fluid motion, I kicked through the rear emergency exit of the tent, a feature I had never thought I would actually need to use. I didn't run toward the trail because I knew the stalker would expect that and likely had the path covered with their superior optics. Instead, I dove into a thicket of dense mountain laurel to the left, moving as quietly as possible while the adrenaline masked the pain of the thorns tearing at my skin. I heard a sharp, frustrated grunt from the campsite, followed by the sound of my tent being violently ripped open and the clatter of my cooking gear being kicked across the dirt. The blue light began to sweep frantically across the clearing, the beam of the night vision searching for my heat signature in the damp air. I stayed pressed against the cold earth, covered in a layer of dead leaves and mud to mask my body heat, watching as the blue light passed just inches above my head. The figure was standing right on the edge of the thicket, their breathing heavy and ragged with a terrifying kind of excitement. "I know you're cold out here," a voice whispered, a low, melodic tone that sent a shiver of pure revulsion down my spine. "It's much warmer if you just come back to the light." I didn't move a muscle, holding my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, waiting for the figure to turn their head just a few degrees to the right. When they did, I lunged forward from the brush, discharging a massive cloud of bear spray directly into the glowing blue lenses of their goggles. A scream of agony tore through the night as the chemicals hit their mark, and the figure collapsed to their knees, clutching their face and dropping the expensive optics into the dirt. I didn't stay to see if they would recover. I sprinted through the woods toward the distant gravel road where I had parked my car, my lungs burning and my heart ready to explode. I reached the vehicle, fumbled with the locks, and tore out of the parking area with my headlights off, fearing that they might have a partner waiting nearby. I drove until I reached the county sheriff's office, where I sat trembling in the lobby until the sun finally rose over the horizon. The deputies went back to the site the next morning and found my tent slashed to ribbons and my gear tossed into the fire pit, but there was no sign of the man in the tactical gear. The only evidence left behind was a shattered pair of high-end night vision goggles, the blue indicator light still faintly glowing in the tall grass. They never caught the person responsible, but they found several memory cards hidden in a hollow tree nearby, filled with hundreds of photos of solo campers sleeping in their tents, all taken from the shadows of the blue light. I sold all my camping gear that next week, and now, whenever I see a blue light on a piece of electronics in my own home, I have to turn it toward the wall. I can't stand the thought of an eye in the dark that sees everything while I see nothing at all.